In describing the kind of thinking which is dominant in 1984, Orwell has coined a word which has already become part of the modern vocabulary: doublethink. Doublethink means the power of holding two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them. This process has to be conscious, or it would not be carried out with sufficient precision, but it also has to be unconscious, or it would bring with it a feeling of falsity, and hence of guilt. It is precisely the unconscious aspect of doublethink which will seduce many a reader of 1984 into believing that the method of doublethink is employed by the Russians and the Chinese, while it is something quite foreign to himself. This, however, is an illusion, as a few examples can demonstrate. We in the West speak of the free world, in which we include not only systems like those of the United States and England, which are based on free elections and freedom of expression, but we include also South American dictatorships. At least we did as long as they existed. We also include various forms of dictatorship like those of Franco and Salazar, and those in South Africa, Pakistan, and Abyssinia. While we speak about the free world, we actually mean all those states which are against Russia and China, and not at all, as the words would indicate, states which have political freedom. Another contemporary example of holding two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting them can be found in our discussion about armament. We spend a considerable part of our income and energy in building thermonuclear weapons, and close our minds to the fact that they might go off and destroy one third or one half or most of our population and that of the enemy. Some go even further. Thus, Herman Kahn, one of the most influential writers on atomic strategy today, states, in other words, war is horrible. There is no question about it. But so is peace, and it is proper with the kind of calculations we are making today to compare the horror of war and the horror of peace and see how much worse it is. Kahn assumes that thermonuclear war might mean the destruction of 60 million Americans, and yet he finds that even in such a case, the country would recover rather rapidly and effectively, and that normal and happy lives for the majority of these survivors and their descendants would not be precluded by the tragedy of thermonuclear war. This view holds: A. That we prepare for war in order to preserve peace. B. That even if war breaks out and the Russians kill one third of our population, and we do the same to them, and if we can, of course, more, still people will live happy lives afterwards. C. That not only war, but also peace is horrible, and it is necessary to examine how much more horrible war is than peace. People who accept this kind of reasoning are called sober. Those who doubt that if 2 million or 60 million died, it would leave America essentially untouched are not sober. Those who point to the political and psychological and moral consequences of such destruction are called unrealistic. While this is not the place for a lengthy discussion on the problem of disarmament, these examples must be given in order to make the point which is essential for the understanding of Orwell's book, namely that doublethink is already with us, and not merely something which will happen in the future and in dictatorships. Another important point in Orwell's discussion is closely related to doublethink, namely that in a successful manipulation of the mind, the person is no longer saying the opposite of what he thinks, but he thinks the opposite of what is true. Thus, for instance, if he has surrendered his independence and his integrity completely, if he experiences himself as a thing which belongs either to the state, the party, or the corporation, then 2 plus 2 are 5, or slavery is freedom. and he feels free because there is no longer any awareness of the discrepancy between truth and falsehood. Specifically, this applies to ideologies. Just as the inquisitors who tortured their prisoners believed that they acted in the name of Christian love, the party rejects and vilifies every principle for which the socialist movement originally stood, and it chooses to do in the name of socialism. And it chooses to do this in the name of socialism. Its content is reversed into its opposite, and yet people believe that the ideology means what it says. In this respect, Orwell quite obviously refers to the falsification of socialism by Russian communism, but it must be added that the West is also guilty of a similar falsification. We present our society as being one of free initiative, individualism, and idealism, when in reality these are mostly words. We are a centralized managerial industrial society of an essentially bureaucratic nature and motivated by a materialism which is only slightly mitigated by truly spiritual or religious concerns. Related to this is another example of doublethink, namely that few writers discussing atomic strategy stumble over the fact that killing, from a Christian standpoint, is as evil or more evil than being killed. The reader will find many other features of our present Western society in Orwell's description in 1984, provided he can overcome enough of his own doublethink. Certainly, Orwell's picture is exceedingly depressing, especially if one recognizes that, as Orwell himself points out, it is not only a picture of an enemy, but of the whole human race at the end of the 20th century. One can react to this picture in two ways, either by becoming more hopeless and resigned, or by feeling there is still time, and by responding with greater clarity and greater courage. All three negative utopias make it appear that it is possible to dehumanize man completely, and yet for life to go on. One might doubt the correctness of this assumption, and think that while it might be possible to destroy the human core of man, one would also in doing this destroy the future of mankind. Such men would be so truly inhuman and lacking in vitality that they would destroy each other, or die out of sheer boredom and anxiety. If the world of 1984 is going to be the dominant form of life on this globe, it will mean a world of madmen, and hence not a viable world. Orwell indicates this very subtly by pointing to the mad gleam in the party leader's eyes. I am sure that neither Orwell, nor Huxley, nor Zamayatin wanted to insist that this world of insanity is bound to come. On the contrary, it was quite obviously their intention to sound a warning by showing where we are headed, for unless we succeed in a renaissance of the spirit, of humanism and dignity, which is at the very roots of Occidental culture, Orwell, as well as the two other authors, is simply implying that the new form of managerial industrialism, in which man builds machines which act like men and develops men who act like machines, is conducive to an era of dehumanization and complete alienation, in which men are transformed into things and become appendices to the process of production and consumption. All three authors imply that this danger exists not only in communism or of the Russian or Chinese versions, but that it is a danger inherent in the modern mode of production and organization, and relatively independent of the various ideologies. Orwell, like the authors of the other negative utopias, is not a prophet of disaster. He wants to warn and to awaken us. He still hopes, but in contrast to the writers of the utopias in the earlier phases of Western society, His hope is a desperate one. The hope can be realized only by recognizing. So 1984 teaches us the danger with which all men are confronted today, the danger of a society of automatons who will have lost every trace of individuality, of love, of critical thought, and yet who will not be aware of it because of double think. Books like Orwell's are powerful warnings, and it would be most unfortunate if the reader smugly interpreted 1984 as another description of Stalinist barbarism, and if he does not see that it means us, too. Erich Fromm.